Hi, folks. Welcome to topic 2 of Unit 2 of the National 5 Biology course. Today, we're going to be looking at control and communication, and that's basically split into looking at our nervous system and looking at our hormonal system. So, let's start off with the nervous system. First of all, well, if we have a look at the diagram here, we can see a nice image here of our nervous system in the top half of our body, and we can see that our nervous system consists of an area called the central nervous system, or the CNS. And we can see that over here. Okay, the central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, the CNS includes both of those things, as well as our overall nervous system containing these nerves. That's those yellow things that are stretching out. So the pink area there, central nervous system. The yellow area are all of the other nerves. Okay, and that's what makes up our nervous system. Now, we are going to focus primarily on the central nervous system at National 5. And as I said a moment ago, the central nervous system, or the CNS, consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And do remember that for the exam, because it's very common for students to accidentally write spine instead of spinal cord. So try and recite that into your memory so that you don't forget that in the exam. Now, talking about our brain, here's a human head with a brain in it. There are three main parts that we need to know about for the exam. Those are the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the medulla. Okay, we need to know about all three of those parts: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the medulla. Now, in addition to knowing where they're located within the brain, okay, and you can see the distinct regions here for each of the three parts, we also need to know the functions of each part. Now, this large area here at the top, that's the cerebrum, and that is responsible for things like your memory, your reasoning, your imagination, your conscious thought, your intelligence, hearing, sight, and senses, and many, many more things as well beyond that, okay? It has a huge number of responsibilities and is a very important part of our brain. We've also got a medulla, which is located here just at the top of the brain stem there. And the medulla controls heart rate and breathing, okay? Those automatic processes, which we don't need to think about consciously while we're asleep, for example. So the medulla is in control of that. And then lastly, we've got this little area at the back here, a bit smaller than the cerebrum, okay, but a bit bigger than the medulla, called the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is important because that is responsible for balance and muscle coordination. Okay, so if you go to trip up and you instinctively put a leg forward to stop yourself falling, that's your cerebellum that is controlling that. Now, our nervous system is made up of three different types of neurons. That's the cells which make up our nervous system. So neurons are of three types. We've got sensory neurons, we've got interneurons, and we've got motor neurons. Okay. And I always say to my class, if you have your phone, what do you need for it to work? Well, apart from charge, etc., you need a SIM card. Okay. So if you remember your SIM, you'll remember the three types of neurons. Okay. So SIM, SIM. And that also tells you the order in which impulses will be detected and then transmitted in the neurons as well. Okay. So we've got sensory, motor neuron, SIM for short. Okay, and we can see an example here. We've got a person there. We've got sensory neurons, which are attached to our sense organs. Okay, sensory neurons are attached to sense organs. And what they do is they pass information towards the central nervous system, towards our brain and spinal cord. Okay, so they are taking information from our sense organs to our central nervous system. Okay, so that's sensory neurons taking information to the CNS. We've also got interneurons, and we can see at the bottom of this diagram here, the interneuron. Okay, you can see it's much smaller than the other two, and it's located within the spinal cord. Okay, so interneurons operate within the central nervous system. We can see within the spinal cord here, which then process information from the senses that require a response. Okay, so they process the information that comes in from the sensory neuron and give an appropriate response. And they do that via a neuron called the motor neuron. Okay, motor neurons enable a response to occur at a place known as the effector. Now, the effector can be a muscle or a gland, and we'll talk more about that in a second, but the effector is the thing that carries out the response to the initial stimulus that got you firing impulses in your sensory neurons. So in this example here, we can see a person, their fingers got too close to a hot flame. The sensory neuron will detect that. It will fire a neuron, it will fire an electrical impulse along the sensory neuron. And eventually it will keep going and keep going and keep going. And eventually it will get to the interneuron, which will process this information in the central nervous system. And then it will transmit another impulse via the motor neuron, this blue one, towards our effector. And in this case, the effector is a muscle in the arm, which contracts to move the hand away from the initial stimulus, which was this little fire here. Okay, so receptors are what detect the sensory input or stimuli. So, for example, your skin has receptors. Okay, you have receptors in your nose and your mouth and your eyes and your ears. All of your sense organs will have receptors. Okay, and we can see in this diagram one in the skin and the fingers there. Okay, so those receptors detect any input or stimulus. Our bodies respond to the stimulus in sometimes a rapid way. Okay, for example, if we contract a muscle, okay, it'll be rapid, or in a slower way. And that way would be something that moves through the blood. Okay, so a hormone or something that's released from one of our glands. All right, so we can either have rapid responses to stimulus from our muscles or slower responses to stimulus from a gland. Okay, now how do we actually transmit this information along our neurons? We do it via things called electrical impulses. Okay, you need to remember that term. An electrical impulse carries messages along neurons. Okay, if you want to send a message from one neuron to the next, an electrical impulse is the way to do it. And then lastly, the last thing you need to know about neurons is how they communicate with each other. Now, neurons don't actually touch. If we zoom in here on this little point here where those two neurons look as though they're close to each other, we can actually see there is a gap between the neurons. Okay, and we call that gap between the neurons a synapse. Okay, and the way that the synapse works is that this gap here means that no electrical impulse can pass from one neuron to the next. So we can't send a message from here over to here using electrical impulses. Instead, we use chemicals which are able to transfer the message from one side to the other. And we can see these little pink chemicals here, which are diffusing across the synapse from one neuron to the next. And there are little receptors on the next neuron there that will bind to these little chemicals that diffuse across the synapse. Okay, so the synapse is the gap between neurons, and we send messages across the synapse by using chemicals that can transfer those messages across where electrical impulses are unable to. The last thing we need to know about the nervous system is about reflexes. Now, you've probably heard of reflexes before, but maybe not necessarily understood the protective function that they form within the human body. So reflexes protect the body from harm. That is a phrase that's well worth learning because, again, it has come up a few times in the exam paper. What is a reflex? A reflex protects the body from harm. But how does it work? Well, it works in a similar way to most of our responses to stimulus, okay? So the stimulus is detected in an area called the receptor, okay? So we've got a stimulus down here and it's detected by a receptor. So the impulse travels along the sensory neuron. That then passes on to the interneuron, which then passes on another impulse via the spinal cord towards the motor neuron, okay? And then this sends a last impulse towards the effector, okay? And the effector carries out our response, okay? So we've got a stimulus that could be light, it could be heat, it could be a noise, it could be anything. That is received by receptors that are found in our sense organs, okay? Those then allow the sensory neuron to fire an impulse, which travels all the way along to the interneuron, which then gets passed via the spinal cord to the motor neuron, which then sends a final impulse to the effector, which then carries out an appropriate response. And remember, if it's a fast response, like the little baby here, it's going to be muscles that respond. You can see the baby's hands going out in that startle reflex. That's because muscles are contracting in response to the stimulus of falling there. On to hormones, second part of this topic. So hormones are released by endocrine glands, okay? These things here called endocrine glands. They release hormones into our bloodstream. Now, hormones are chemical messengers, okay? That means they are in the form of chemicals and they send messages all around our body from one place to another, okay? Other features of hormones which you need to know about are they are a type of protein. We know that from Unit 1. They are chemical messengers. We know that from just now and also from Unit 1. The next part, which is important, is they are specific to some target tissues. They are shaped to fit receptors. They are released or produced by endocrine glands, which we just learned about there. They are carried in the blood or the bloodstream, and they can sometimes have a long-term effect as well as a more immediate one. So how do hormones get from these endocrine glands where they're released into the bloodstream to the places where they have to go to? Well, the places they go to are called target tissue. Okay, they're called a target tissue. And those target tissues have what are called complementary. We know from Unit 1, complementary means that it fits well together. Receptor proteins, and we know receptors as well from Share in topic 1.4 for specific hormones. And again, we've used that word specific before in biology. We use it a lot. And it means that only one thing will fit with another thing. Okay. In this case, only that tissue, the one that's specific, will be affected by those particular hormones. And if we look at the diagram here, we can see how that works. So we've got an endocrine gland here, okay? The endocrine gland releases hormones into the bloodstream. Okay, these yellow things are the hormones. Now, when the hormones try and bind to this tissue, the non-target tissue, you can see they're not the right shape. They are not complementary to these receptor proteins. The hormone is not the right shape. It's not complementary to the receptor proteins. Whereas further along here, when it arrives at this tissue, you can see that the hormone is complementary to the target tissue's receptor proteins here. And so they bind to those receptor proteins and initiate a response within the target tissue. Okay, so they have target tissue has complementary receptor proteins, which are for specific hormones, so that only that tissue will be affected by the hormones that are released. And let's have a look at an example of some hormones that are released into our bloodstream. So we have an organ called our pancreas. And our pancreas is an important one because it both detects changes in our blood glucose, but also releases hormones in response to that. So we have things called pancreatic receptors, and their job is to detect changes in the blood glucose concentration. We can either have an increased blood glucose level or a decreased one. Okay. Now, when that happens, when we get an increase or a decrease, the pancreas will then secrete, okay, the pancreas is an endocrine gland. It will then secrete either more insulin, that's a hormone, or glucagon, also another hormone. Now, insulin is released when there's an increase in blood glucose levels, and glucagon is secreted when there is a decrease in blood glucose levels. Now, the rhyme I always teach my class to remember this in the exam is when the glucose rushes in, secrete insulin, and when the glucose has gone, release glucagon. Okay, if you can remember that rhyme, you'll remember when each hormone is released. So when the sugar rushes in or the glucose rushes in, release insulin. When the glucose has gone, release glucagon. So that's the two hormones, insulin and glucagon, that you need to know about that the pancreas will secrete when there are changes in the blood glucose levels. And it's the pancreatic receptors that detect those changes in blood glucose concentration. Now, once we have released a hormone, we need a target tissue for those hormones. And the target tissue is the liver. Okay. So the liver, in both circumstances here, is the target tissue for these hormones. And when they bind to the receptors in the liver responds by either storing excess glucose as glycogen when levels are too high, or breaking down stored glycogen into glucose. And that's when we have a decrease or a low level of glucose. All right. So either converts excess glucose to stored glycogen, that's with insulin, or it breaks down stored glycogen back into glucose. That is glucagon that does that. And then we'll either remove the excess glucose from the bloodstream, or we will release the glucose that is broken down from glycogen back into the bloodstream. And both these responses in each circumstance will return the glucose levels to normal. Okay, so this is all about restoring the glucose levels to normal. That's why we call it blood glucose regulation. All right, so you need to know all of the parts that are involved here. You need to know the two hormones and what effect those two hormones have on the liver. Okay, we need to know keywords like, for example, don't get mixed up with glucagon and glycogen and glucose. They're all so similar. Glucose is the sugar that is in our blood that we know that we need for aerobic respiration. Glycogen is how glucose is stored when we have too much of it. And glucagon is a hormone that's released by the pancreas when the glucose has gone, i.e., the glucose levels have decreased. Okay, folks, so I hope that was useful. We're going to move on to our past paper questions in the next section, but I hope the lecture part of this was good and you managed to get a bit out of it. As always, leave me comments about what was good, what you'd like to hear more about, or if you have any questions. Okay, folks, so here we are in the second part of the lesson where we look at applying what we've just learned to some exam questions. So the first one here says the diagram below represents the human brain. Which line in the table below identifies structures 1, 2, and 3 of the human brain? Now, as always, I would suggest that you pause the video and have a go at this yourself first before I talk through the answers. Now, structure 1, before I even look at the table, I'm going to look at this. I'm going to say structure 1 is this large structure at the top here. Now, if you know your brain diagram well enough, you'll know that's the cerebrum. Number 2 is this second largest structure here at the back of the head, at the back of the brain, which is the cerebellum. And number 3 here then must be the medulla, which is found just here at the top of the brainstem. So 1, cerebrum, 2 is the cerebellum, and 3 is the medulla. Okay, so it has to be D, our answer there. You need to know the various parts and just be careful you don't get your cerebrum and cerebellum mixed up, because a lot of students do that and it's understandable because it's very similar as a word. Okay, but just go over that a number of times until you're happy with the difference between the two. Next question, which of the diagrams below identifies neurons and the direction of travel of nerve impulses? So I told you earlier on, when you are getting your phone to work, one of the key things you need to remember is to put in your SIM, okay? Remember your SIM. So SIM. So that means that we start off at the sensory neuron, then the impulse travels towards the interneuron, which is in the CNS, which then travels the impulse onto the motor neuron. And the motor neuron then sends the impulse onto the effector. So SIM. Now we replace the central nervous system here essentially with the interneuron, okay? That is essentially what the central nervous system is representing here. So which one goes the right way? Well, sensory into central nervous system into motor neuron seems right to me, okay? But we'll move on to the others to check. So that's the right direction for the sensory neuron, but the motor neuron's going the wrong way. So we can eliminate that one. Sensory neuron's going the wrong way there, and so is the motor. And then for the last one, again, the sensory is the wrong way, even though the motor neuron is actually the right way this time. So the only one that's completely correct is A. Number 8 here, it says the list below refers to stages in response of the nervous system to a stimulus. We have to put them into the correct order. Okay, so we got 5 stages, correct order. So first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to detect a stimulus, okay? So that's going to be number 4, isn't it? That's going to be first. So number 2 is going to be sending those electrical impulses via our sensory neuron towards our nervous system. So that's going to be this one here. We then need the central nervous system through the interneuron to process that information or sort that information. We then need to send an electrical impulse via the motor neuron to our muscles. And then lastly, we would have a response produced. Okay, so we should be looking to do 4, then 3, then 1, then 2, then 5. Okay, so 4, then 3, then 1, then 2, then 5. So it's going to be A, isn't it? Once we've sorted through all of those stages. The next one shows the neurons involved in a reflex arc, which letter. Next one says, which line in the table below identifies correctly the effects of a decrease in blood glucose level on the concentrations of insulin and glucagon in the blood? So we know that when the glucose rushes in, we release insulin, and when the glucose has gone, we release glucagon. So a decrease in blood glucose is where the glucose has gone. So therefore, we would increase our glucagon and decrease our insulin. So increase in glucagon and a decrease of insulin there. That's the one we're looking for there. The diagram shows some of the structures found in the reflex arc. We've got P, Q, and R there, okay? So P comes from the nerve ending towards the central nervous system. We've got R there right embedded in the central nervous system. And we've got Q, which is going out towards a muscle here. Now, the way I remember it in my head is I remember M and M. Okay, motor neuron is attached to the muscle, M and M. Okay, so Q must be the motor neuron. R is found in the central nervous system, so that must be the interneuron. And therefore, this one attached to the nerve endings is going to be P, the sensory neuron. So our answer is going to be B for this one. Okay, we'll do one more multiple choice. The diagram represents a section through the brain. Okay, we've got G and we've got H. Now, again, before I get to the question, I will always think, right, what is G and what is H? Well, G is this large domed area at the top of our brain, which is called the cerebrum, and H is our cerebellum. Now, again, before I even get to the question, I'm thinking, right, what does the cerebrum do again? So it's things like memory, intelligence, personality, our senses, and so on. Whereas H is associated with balance and muscle coordination. So let's have a look and see what the question asks us. Which of the following links a letter to its correct structure and function? So G is the cerebrum. Okay, I'm happy with that. That seems right. And is the site of reasoning and memory. Again, that seems right to me. I'm going to give that a tick for now. We'll just check the other ones are not right though before we circle that one. So G is the cerebellum. Nope, that's wrong. Okay. H is the medulla. That's wrong. And then H is the cerebellum. That's right. And it controls breathing and heart rate. That's wrong because it's our medulla that controls the breathing and heart rate. So the only one that's completely right is answer A there. Okay. So let's move on to a longer question here just to test our knowledge a little bit more. So the regulation of glucose in the blood is represented in the diagram below. Okay, we've got a nice diagram here. We've got high and low blood glucose, we've got organs here, we've got hormones here, and more organs there, and then back to normal blood glucose levels at the end. So it says the diagram above has two options in each of the four boxes. Okay, A, B, C, and D. We can see there's two options there, separated by a backslash. Circle the correct option in each box. Okay. Now this is a reasonably tricky question because if you just start at the top, you're going to struggle a little bit to work out which one is which. So what I always suggest to my students is for this one, you start at the bottom and work your way up because there are more clues at the bottom than there are at the top. And the reason for that is because down here it says organ Y releases glucose into the blood. So as soon as I see organ Y releasing glucose into the blood, I'm thinking, well, the reason you would do that is because the glucose levels were low. So therefore, we're going to circle low up here. And when the glucose levels are low or the glucose has gone, we would secrete glucagon. Okay. And that deals with A and C. We go over to this side. It says organ Y stores glucose as glycogen. Now think, why would we store glucose as glycogen? Well, it's because our glucose levels are too high. That's why we would store glucose as glycogen. And we know that when the glucose rushes in, i.e. the levels become really high, we release insulin. Okay, so that's how we would approach that question and how we'd work out the answers there. For A part 2, we have to identify organs X and Y. Okay, now organ X is the one that detects the lower high blood glucose, and it's also the organ which releases the insulin or the glucagon. So organ X is going to be our pancreas. We've got pancreatic receptors detecting the blood glucose levels, and the pancreas releases our hormones. So what's organ Y then? Well, we know that the pancreas releases our hormones because it's an endocrine gland, but the target tissue, the organ that these hormones go to, is the liver. Okay. And the liver is the one that converts glucose to glycogen or glycogen back into glucose. And then lastly, it says insulin and glucagon are hormones. Describe two features of hormones. Okay. So we had a little list back in our lesson, didn't we, of all the different features of hormones? So things like they are made of protein would be one. They are chemical messengers is another. They travel in the blood is another. Oh, they are released by endocrine glands is another. They bind to complementary receptors on the target tissue would be another one. Okay. Yeah. So they would all do it. What we've got, we've got five there, five options for those two marks. Okay. Any one of them would have got you a mark there. And it was looking for two of those features in order to get the question right for that particular one. Okay. Number 6 here, it says the diagram below shows how the neurons involved in a reflex action, neurons J, K, and L form a reflex arc. Okay. Okay. So this question asks us, describe how information is passed along a neuron. So hopefully we remember from earlier on that information is passed along a neuron via electrical impulses. Okay. And that's what we have to say for your answer there. Don't be tempted to just say like electricity or electrical or something like that, or electrical messages. Say electrical impulses. That's giving you the best chance to get the mark for that question. For B, select one of the neurons shown in the diagram and tick the appropriate box below. Name the type of neuron and describe its particular function. Okay, so it doesn't really matter which neuron we go for here. Hopefully we know all of them and their function, but go with the one you feel most confident about. So for example, if you went for J, we're looking for the sensory neuron. Okay, if you went for J, that was. If you went for K, K is going to be our motor neuron. And lastly, if you went for L, we're looking at the interneuron. Okay. And as I said earlier on, it doesn't matter which one you go for, as long as you get the correct function for that neuron, you will get the answer for it. Okay, you'll get the marks for it, sorry. So if we said sensory neuron, what does the sensory neuron do? It sends impulses from the receptor to the CNS. Okay. The motor neuron sends impulses from the CNS to the effector and the interneuron. So that's located in the CNS. So that's not its function. It processes information and passes impulses from the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. Okay. Let's make that box a little bit bigger so you can read all of that. There we go. Okay. So any one of those descriptions there, something along those lines would have got you the mark there. As I say, go with the one that you feel most confident about in terms of answering that. Okay, folks. So we're going to leave it there for today's lesson. I hope those questions were good at applying the knowledge we learned in the lesson to an exam situation. If you've got any questions or any comments or anything else you're not sure about, please leave them in the comments below and I'll get back to you. But for now, folks, thanks for joining me and class dismissed.